Hello. The first recorded law attributed to God was "Let there be light." It may not sound like a law, like the laws of Moses, but if God is a rock solid and steadfast as he says he is, then what he says must be binding. Jesus showed little enthusiasm or interest for the laws of Moses, but great interest in finishing his Father's work, which is the rebuilding of the kingdom of God. The realization that all the parables and the entire book of his Revelation relate to the work of gathering, planting, restoring, and resurrecting the lost sheep of the house of Israel shows very clearly what it is Jesus had enthusiasm and interest for. But why was building this kingdom so important? The answer lies in the Garden of Eden. We have no archaeological evidence for this garden or for the first couple who lived in it, and the earliest records are thousands of years after the fact. But what the story relays is that something happened to humanity when that spark of light ignited and we had free choice and became, as it says, like God. God wasn't angry with Adam and Eve. He was proud of them. It was his command, after all, that there should be light, and now that they could see, they could choose and understand. But there would be consequences. Adam, man, was told he would die as a result of this great gift, a disturbing fact that we were first made aware of during the 20th century. Up until then, we only thought that God wanted to destroy us in his righteous wrath and anger because he didn't like the fact that we behaved like nasty little children. It was a shock to realize we had become quite capable of destroying ourselves without God's assistance. God was in fact 6,000 years ahead of his time, but like a good father, he allows us to make decisions, but also to deal with the consequences of our actions. But ultimately, it is his duty as a good father to make sure that we don't kill ourselves in the process. And that safeguard defines all prophecy, his great plan, the project, and the determination of the Lord. I'm Alan Anzick. Welcome to Coffee Table Discussions. This is my coffee table, this is my coffee, and coming up next is the discussion.
But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat thereof you shall surely die. God's instruction not to eat of the tree of good and evil was not because he wanted the fruit for himself, and it's almost unimaginable that any deity worth its salt would not have known what was going to happen. As pointed out in the introduction, what we've been told in the story of the events in the garden are far more important than how factual any of the events are. It is a story of our self-realization and the consequences that would have led to the death of humanity. But first, let's look at the conventional reaction to the event. It's a very telling insight into how we view God, who is supposed to be our Father. Christians like to believe they have advanced from the worship of a multitude of pagan gods and goddesses. In fact, we've made considerable progress over the centuries by rationalising the number of deities down to one, which is definitely an efficiency improvement. But we still spend considerable time trying to appease, cajole, make deals with, and behave in ways to win rewards and treats from him. We consider our God to be our Father, but in many ways he's quite an abusive father, going completely ballistic, for instance, when you happen to steal a few apples. We generally believe that it's the disobedience of Adam and Eve which had upset God so much. After all I had done for them, how could they possibly have treated me with such callous disloyalty and eaten fruit I told them specifically not to eat, even though it's fantastic looking, juicy, and everyone's banging on about it, and it's right in the middle of their front yard. Betrayal, betrayal, oh the betrayal. You can understand why he would be so upset. Any narcissistic father would have acted exactly the same, and I'm sure there are parents out there like that. But the reality is that no anger was ever displayed to Adam and Eve. The idea of God's anger is purely our traditional interpretation of God's mood at the time.
As a father, I made household rules for two reasons. The first was to preserve my sanity and avoid the impulse to take my wife and run away. And the second, but most important reason, was for my children's good. However, the last thing a child is likely to believe is that rules are of any personal benefit to them. They are merely an obstruction to enjoyment. Children suspect that rules are applied by parents for the sake of parents, so when they grudgingly submit, it is because they realise that sometimes it's just easier to please the old folk. They follow our rules because they think it makes us happy, and appeasing their parents is the best way of getting us to leave them alone so they can get on with their own life. What they never realise until they mature and have children of their own perhaps, is that wanting them to follow our seemingly arbitrary rules is not an ego trip. It has little to do with wanting to be obeyed and everything to do with wanting them to grow up to be rational and independent like us, most of the time. We think that following God's rules, most of which have been made up by other people, will make him happy. But God is only interested in our development. And since the day we decided we wanted to think for ourselves, his only concern as a good father is to stop us from killing ourselves. This is the motivation behind prophecy. Now, have a look at what was said just before Adam ate the fruit which would change everything.
For in the day that you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. We know that Adam didn't die that afternoon because apparently he lived for another 900 years after that and had children. But notice the apparent contradiction. Behold, the man is become as one of us to know good and evil. Does that sound like a literal same-day death? You will surely die. The man is become as one of us. Eating the fruit hasn't caused his death. It's not poisonous. But this very, very strange comment, the man has become like one of us, is the reason and the cause of the impending death. God was never angry with Adam, but he knew the difficulties that lay ahead for the couple and ultimately for humanity. Being enlightened has its advantages, but these advantages come at a cost. Understanding our mortality for one, we fear death well in advance of the moment adrenaline kicks in as an aid to help us respond to danger. This haunting knowledge of vulnerability is part of our continued feeling of being exposed and naked. We can see into the future and predict outcomes, maybe not that accurately, but enough to allow our insecurities to envisage enemies, shortages of resources, and possible glories which feed our instinctive appetites and motivate our creativity to destroy our enemies, control nature, and those around us. Eating from that tree was very dangerous, and God knew it. Here they are, happily being naked, not caring about anything. But that all changes when they realise how naked and vulnerable they are, now that they are no longer blind. But this isn't just about clothing and nudity, even though it does say that God made the first items of clothing. And God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skins and clothed them. There you go, the oldest profession, dressmaking, more than just endorsed by the most powerful being in the universe, but skillfully practiced by the same. I know at least one person who will be thrilled by that revelation. And I will put hostility between you, the serpent that is, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. God is talking to the seed or offspring here when he said, he shall bruise your head. This is prophecy. God's design and plan was embedded into the first word spoken after our couple had lost their naivety and things had changed, temporarily for the worse. And it is interesting that the first prophetic words speak directly of Christ and the solution to the problem they faced. Jesus was there in the beginning through the word spoken by God, and he was chosen immediately as the seed that would contest the offspring of the serpent, who through history has always challenged the Lord's vision, which is why when the serpent appears in prophecy, it is depicted as a serpent. But what does it mean, I will put hostility between your seed and her seed? Are we talking about the great serpent wars, or is it a mythology to explain why we fear snakes? Out of all my phobias, why just pick that one? It's not even top of my list. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain and your conception. In pain, you will bring forth children.
As a side note, there's the question of whether the story of Genesis is literal, symbolic, or just a Jewish creation myth. Was the universe and everything just created in 6 days with Sunday off, and were Adam and Eve the first humans? Just very briefly, without too much explanation, in today's episode at least, consider these following points. Men and women, plural, were created in chapters 1. Adam and Eve came later in chapter 2. This would, of course, explain from the text itself why Adam's kids were able to go off into other communities and marry other people. The 7 days of creation do not really fit in with the facts as we understand them from natural science, but fit perfectly with prophecy. The 7 times curse, the time required to restore and rebuild the kingdom of God within 7 1,000-year epochs, the existence of the prophetic time frames, half of 7 times, 3.5 times, 3.5 days and half a week, the sun and the moon and the stars, which Jesus talks about being a sign of the heavens and the restored kingdom, right in the middle of the 7 times punishment, which is exactly the prophetic 3.5, which is also in the middle of Daniel's week. That correlates exactly with the middle of the week in Genesis, where the sun and the moon and the stars are set as signs. My minor puzzle, that is the second day of the sun and the moon, is made, but the sun didn't start shining until the day 4, and even if the writers knew little of science and understood astronomy, they would have understood that the logic of the sun causing daylight. But the prophecy, we know the connection between the sun and Abraham and his wife Sarah and the moon and the promises that were made relatively shortly after God said, "Let there be light." Adam and Eve became the representation of that spark of light and the self-realization of consciousness. Yes, I know it all sounds a bit mad when rattled off incoherently like I just did. But the relationship and anomalies do make sense when things are slowed down a tad and explained properly, like I promised will happen when we get to Revelation 11 and 12, and talk about the prophetic time frame that consistently raises its head throughout prophecy. In the meantime, since this is an episode about the beginning, I would like to summarize the more controversial aspects of Genesis, which unfortunately are a persistent legacy of medieval religion and thinking, with the following note. The whole of chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Genesis has little to do with astronomy, geology, or biology, but have everything to do with prophecy.
Back to the story. The idea that women can blame Eve for not enjoying childbirth, is that just a Judeo-Christian mythology to explain why labour is so arduous? Take note that what is said to the woman is not independent from what is said to the serpent. God's statement was about future offspring, not a random collection of unexplainable things we have to endure in life, like snakes and childbirth. Hostility between your children and her children. In pain you will bring forth children. This is an ongoing battle between the serpent's children and her children, and whether that be the nations of Israel battling empires trying to defeat and subjugate God's kingdom, the Pharisees opposing Christ and then the first church, or the church itself when it became a dominating European power and clashed with God's work. Whatever opposes, even ignorantly, usually ignorantly, is the work of the serpent, or to put it another way, a product of our blind appetite. The prophecy, however, is connected to the solution of the dilemma of what to do about the fact that Adam had eaten the fruit and now mankind would die. Genesis is about prophecy, and here it is. Do you recall the woman in chapter 12 of Revelation associated with the sun, moon and stars? That was prophecy being fulfilled. The stars represented the 12 tribes or 12 sons of Jacob, whose great and so forth grandmother was Eve. And these are her children, the offspring. And to the woman he said, "Great will be your pain in childbirth." And she was with child, and she cried out in pain of labour, ready to give birth. We are being told here of a continued conflict of opposition to the great plan of God, which will shortly be expressed to Abraham in the form of a promise. But in the meantime, ultimately in this conflict, the seed of Eve will dominate and win. We will see a very practical reason why a plan was needed, which should make the reason for the conflict clear. Because with all the talk of pregnant ladies with stars on their heads hovering in outer space, forbidden fruit and chatty pythons, it is all a bit strange, and I wouldn't blame anyone for giving up at this point.
But keep this in mind. The imaginative and colourful symbolism is not just a prophecy to Adam, but to all mankind. When you eat of this tree, you will die. It is not what is said which is important, but what we are being told. And the death of our kind would have been inevitable. How? Well, we've recently discovered a smorgasbord of ways to pick from. And why? Well, what happens when you give a bunch of school kids loaded shotguns? It may have taken 6,000 years for the sudden realisation of the problem humanity would face to be apparent, but prophecy was there and waiting from the beginning. And since then, everything has been structured towards the solution. Let's take a look at what Christians like to do every Sunday, the communion service.
The children of Israel celebrated their liberation from the slavery of Egypt with a ritual called the Passover. During this feast, a lamb was sacrificed, roasted and eaten. The sacrificial lamb was known as the Passover lamb, which makes perfect sense. Now, besides eating the roast lamb, part of the ritual was to splash its blood around the doorway, just like this guy here painting his house with it. If you want to know where the idea came from for the sprinkling of the blood of Christ, it's a deliberate connection to this ritual. The reason for this elaborate, tasty and messy act was so when the angel of death would come on this one particular night, it would pass over the inhabitants of the houses which had the blood sprinkled on it and spare the occupants from the plague that was to inflict the Egyptians. The Israelites had become hostages and slaves to the Egyptians, and God was about to liberate them and take them away to a place where he could start the work of building the kingdom he had promised Abraham centuries before. Apparently it worked, and its success was demonstrated by all the children of Israel, besides the vegetarians, walking out of Egypt as free people. The Passover signifies freedom from fear, death and slavery. But what does a Jewish sheep sacrificing celebration have to do with Christianity and the communion ritual? And secondly, how does this relate to what was said in the Garden of Eden? Generally, Christians understand that the Last Supper, just before Christ's crucifixion, mimics the Passover and is directly connected with the observance of Easter. Jesus is the Lamb of God, and he was sacrificed in accordance with the Passover ceremony. This, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper. Most Christians would know that this was the first communion service almost 2,000 years ago. And Jesus instructed those in attendance to perform the ritual of eating bread and drinking wine as a symbolic consumption of him as the Passover lamb. They were told to do this on a regular basis, telling them, "I want you to remember what is about to happen until the work I'm going away to do is finished." The event was deliberately orchestrated by Jesus to coincide with the Jewish Passover ceremony to make the point stick. In this painting, the Passover lamb that is to be sacrificed and eaten is in the middle of the table, and it's obviously Jesus. And by eaten, we mean, of course, when Jesus said, "Drink my blood and eat my body." Much, much, much more will be said on that in Series 3. And when we do, the connection with Lazarus and the lost 12 tribes of Israel will be eye-opening and far more interesting than that non-existent M in Leonardo's painting, which is supposed to be a monogram of Mary Magdalene. Through this ceremony and in later writings, including the book of Revelation, it is made clear that he is the sacrificial Passover lamb. And his blood, even though not literally splashed around the doorway, is symbolically the sacrificial blood in the Israelitish ritual. Now, what about what was said in the Garden of Eden? "He shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." In Christian teaching, the death and resurrection of Jesus represents a victory, and the clash which is depicted in this verse between the offspring of the serpent and the offspring of the woman is that victory. What's exciting about that verse is that it is a prophecy that is calling out Jesus 4,000 years before the event that made him the Passover lamb. A lovely piece of forward planning, but why is that 4,000 number so significant? Well, because the instruction for the Passover given in Exodus chapter 12 was to select a lamb not on the day when it was to be killed, but 4 days before the sacrifice. "You shall take the lamb on the 10th day of the month." There it is, minding its own business in the paddock, but looking slightly honoured it's been selected for something. And keep it until the 14th day. I'm really quite glad they don't know what's going on. But the point of interest is that the Passover lamb was to be called out 4 days before. Jesus was there in the beginning. The two infants playing together while sitting on Eve are Cain and Abel, of course, but through her seed 4,000 years later, we have Jesus. Now, I understand that 4 days isn't 4,000 years, but the Passover the Israelites kept was not just a ritual, it was a parable and a prophecy. And as we will see, there are many examples of parables and prophecy where a day will represent 1,000 years. Jesus was called out 4,000 years before his sacrifice in the same way as the Passover lamb was called out 4 days before its. 1, 2, 3, 4 days? 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. Now remember what was said to the serpent. He, the offspring of Eve, will bruise your head, but you, the serpent, will bruise his heel. In what way was Jesus bruised? Well, the crucifixion for a start. That was a short victory for the opposition. But his resurrection showed that the death of God's wife, that is, the nations of Israel whom God had chosen and married, would not be the finish of them or the pledge that was made to Abraham to build a nation through them. He would resurrect her again. In summary, everything which follows from the first few chapters of Genesis was triggered by what happened in Eden. The entire narrative was prophecy, and Christ became the spirit of that prophecy, which is why Jesus said in the book of Revelation, "For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." That's his testimony. Prophecy isn't just the interesting foretelling of future events. Prophecy is the plan, and it is the work of Christ.
So far, we have seen that humanity was on a pathway to death in one form or other. But God was well ahead of the problem, and the solution was described immediately after the dilemma began. From Genesis to the end of his revelation, the thread of prophecy has been maintained, and this is what Jesus testifies to. As a result of this process, we will understand who we are and who God is. It may be a struggle for us also, but the burden to ensure the achievement of the salvation promised to Eve is entirely God's duty.
The Lord took Abraham under the desert stars and told him they would be a witness to the infallibility of his promise of salvation. Next episode in this series, we will see how God took it upon himself to make an unconditional promise to Abraham to raise a kingdom and nations through his offspring, which would be the vehicle used to fulfill his plan. As the line of prophecy from Eve begins to thread its way through time and space.
Jesus said, "Where 2 or more are gathered in my name, there will I be also." So let's take advantage of this offer and join in again next week for another coffee table discussion.